Okay. And I will be talking a bit about assemblage theory and some kind of its discontents and possible upgrades. And please don't, don't expect that this will be some kind of performative lecture. This will be some kind of boring academic style lecture. So get prepared, please. There even will be some formulas. Sometimes it might be quite teeth-breaking a bit, so please get prepared. I will try to do my best to explain. And one more clarification, if you have questions which are crucial for your understanding, which you don't know what some word means, please raise your hand and ask. And I hope we will have some kind of question session, last 15 minutes of my talk. So, and I will start with the quote by Holbrooke and Peterson, which will set the mood of my talk, I guess. So, new ontologies now abound in the form of an array of novel conceptual vocabularies in aesthetics of thought: assemblages, affects, networks, multiplicities, posthumanism, multispecies, Anthropocene, new materialism, speculative realism, emergence, vibrancy, interaction, the para, the off, the beta, and so on. What's the idea? So idea is that it's obvious that our vocabulary of thinking, the new ontology of the world, is overwhelmed with different terms and different perspectives. And it is absolutely obvious that there came some kind of ontological turn in philosophy and some other strands of humanities. And this is absolutely inevitable to underline it. So, first of all, I would like to say that there is not so much one and only ontological turn in humanities, and thinking about philosophy, about the topics which are of interest in that concrete festival, and the idea that ontological turn, the turn to ontology, to what there is, now is in three distinct strands. The first one is ontological turn in anthropology. What is it about? So the idea is that when some kind of anthropologist tries to explore, to observe some primordial community, he doesn't theorize upon his ethnography. So he sees that some guys are gathering some kind of plants and think that those plants are the gods, or and like Levi-Strauss theorized upon it some kind of strict structure that governs their behavior and their kinship and so on. No, ontological turn in anthropology is about making ethnography, but taking concepts which they use in their ethnography seriously. Like, if those people, those primordial people which gathering those plants and thinking that those plants are gods, anthropologists should think that these plants are really gods. And what does it mean to think that some kind of thing means a lot to another people? And the idea that ontological turn anthropology is not so much about substantive ontology in a philosophical sense. It's all about using ontology as a methodological tool, like what it would be if we imagine that those concepts which those primordial people use are really, really important and really real, so to speak. So this is the first idea of ontological turn. This is, let's call it anthropological ontological turn. The second one is ontological turn is science and technology studies, and you might know it by works of Bruno Latour and famous actor network theory, and famous slogan, I guess, that things might act, material objects might act, and so on. The idea is pretty the same, that some kind of if we turn to some kind of history of philosophy, history of science, we will see that there were not so much, not always one and only conception of, say, heat. What is heat? And sometimes it was the conception of phlogiston and so on. So the idea is pretty the same in an anthropological ontological term. And the last one, the philosophical ontological term, is the most hard and the most crucial thing here, I guess. And I will critique the last one, the philosophical ontological term, since it doesn't only use ontology as a methodology to clarify something, but it tends and have pretension that some kind of ontology is the final dictionary. So some kind of revealing natural ontological truth about the world. And this is the example of thinking about ontological turn in anthropology. The epistemological problem of how one sees things is turned into the ontological question of what there is to be seen in the first place. So it is the idea that I have said a couple of minutes ago about anthropology, when some anthropologists don't theorize upon his ethnography. Like, it's not about perspective, it's about meanings of real concepts. To illustrate this, let's turn to picture. So, picture from Tim Ingold, the idea of ontological turn in anthropology. So we have here some kind of natures of really real reality, the world of reality, upon which there are some kind of different worldviews. They are projected somehow to the reality. And universal reason is some kind of Western science, so to speak. It's, again, it's philosophy, it is science, and so on. So the idea of ontological turn in anthropology is to subvert those two dichotomies, this picture, to subvert the picture that there is one universal reason, which might see different worldviews and to judge them like it's correct, it's not correct, it's dumb, it's clever, and so on. And the second dichotomy which ontological turn anthropology tries to subvert is the dichotomy of nature and culture. And this is pretty the same for the all three ontological terms. So, to illustrate it, in effect, the sovereign perspective of abstract reason is a product of the compounding of two dichotomies, between humanity and nature and between modernity and tradition. This is the picture taken from David Blue's work Anti-Latour, and it's about science and technology studies, but the idea is pretty the same, as I have said, for all three ontological terms, that the distinction between nature and culture or nature and society is artificial. And the idea of all ontological terms, all three that I have mentioned, is to find some kind of univocal foundation which is behind the dichotomy of nature and culture. And there is a different amalgam, as you can say it, of solutions to this problem. So the idea is to find some kind of origin from which nature and society or nature and culture arise. But the problem with it is that by searching for some kind of foundation upon which the distinction of nature and society is constructed upon, we can't avoid implementing some kind of politics. We do not do science, we do politics. Since, let's take for an example the work of Bruno Latour. He says that okay, we had two distinct kinds of science. For example, in 19th century France, one kind of science was Louis Pasteur, which invented some kind of vaccine and tried to expand it and to spread it throughout the France and make himself an obligatory passage point for other people who owned some kind of cows, and they wanted their cows not to die from some kind of disease. And this Louis Pasteur managed to spread his invention, his vaccine, to the whole France, and this is how Latour says Louis Pasteur invented the microbes. He didn't, revealed the natural truth or discovered microbes. Latour says that, yes, Louis Pasteur just created the microbes. He just invented them. And it's all about politics. Because when we say that there is no reality which is behind our cognition, which is waiting for our discovering it, we are not more making science. We are diving into politics, and this is quite bad. So equating ontology with politics doesn't do away with anthropocentrism. The idea which consists of the statement that the world is made for humans, and the humans are the center of the earth. But such kind of equating ontology with politics simply amplifies this anthropocentrism, and this is what my lecture is about, and how to avoid this kind of thing. So I will stop on DeLanda's assemblage theory, because I think that this theory is one of the strongest theories among philosophical ontological turn. You might know different strands of philosophical ontological turn examples, like object-oriented ontologies, different kinds of Graham Harman, of Timothy Morton, and so on. The idea is pretty same, but DeLanda's assemblage theory is more about, it's more popular, it's more strong, it is implemented in different humanities, especially in territorial, like human geography, urban studies, architecture, and so on. So the idea of assemblage theory is quite easy, I guess. So there is not some kind of distinct objects which are strictly natural or strictly cultural. All objects, all material objects, immaterial objects can collapse into some kind of assemblage, some kind of some kind of assemblage which is made of exterior relationships. So, little bit of context of what assemblage theory is. It is, in a nutshell, it is explication of Gilles Deleuze's ontology. So, the very popular statement that pluralism equals monism. What does it mean? It means that the only thing that really exists is difference, to put it simply. So this is the idea that Deleuze takes from middle century scholastic philosopher Duns Scotus, and the idea of univocity of being. Univocity of being is the idea that the only thing that all beings share among each other is the excess of difference. All they have is excess of difference. So this is explication of the idea that pluralism equals monism. So DeLanda takes this kind of Deleuzean ontology and tries to make it more rigorous, more strict, tries to define all the concepts that Deleuze used in mathematical, natural scientifics funded way, and absolutely does away with Deleuzean metaphoric concepts. So next, the second point. assemblage theory is a theory that tries to overcome not only two dichotomies that I mentioned a couple of minutes ago, the dichotomy between nature and culture, dichotomy between modern world and tradition, but I think that the most interesting thing that assemblage is a concept which tries to overcome the dichotomy of part and whole. So this is why assemblage theory is sometimes called flat ontology. So the ontology where all objects are situated on a flat surface. There is no hierarchies at all in that kind of ontology. So, and the assemblage, the basic ontological unit of this theoretical scheme is assemblage, and it is historically contingent individual. This means that assemblage is not some kind of Platonic form that exists universally once and for all. The idea that it is historically contingent in that sense that you might have some kind of individual like species, and that species is in the process of morphogenesis, like 3 or 4 like dogs lived in one area, and one day they met some other species and they started to mutate somehow. So the idea that there is no essence, and like Platonic essence, and the idea of assemblage theory is to avoid the idea of essence. So there is morphogenetic process instead of essence, and the idea that contingency and exterior relations between assemblages is the most important idea. So next, brief introduction. How assemblages interact with each other? They interact causally. It means that the parts of assemblages interact with each other and influence each other in a way that this has consequences. And this is idea which is brought by DeLanda from dynamic systems theory. The idea that interactions between some kind of objects are non-linear and contingent. It's not about mechanistic explanations, the determinism, mechanism ideas of physics, like if you have some kind of cause, you will have some kind of outcome, and the same cause always causes same outcome. If A, then B. No, says DeLanda, there is no linear relationship. The A might cause B, but not always, and not only B, and might be C, and so on. So this is the idea of non-linearity. So the idea of contingency of causal interaction is about that it is not completely random interaction, but it is not completely determined. It might be otherwise. So the contingency means that interaction might be otherwise. So next, this kind of contingent causal interaction, and this is crucial idea of assemblage theory, leads to emergence of new entities. So this is the idea of morphogenesis that I introduced 2 minutes ago. So when some kind of two objects, say my phone and my head, start to interact with each other in some causal contingent way, they might be causing some kind of emergence of new entities, say the entity of art object. This wasn't an art object 30 seconds ago, but now it is. It's a bad example, sorry, but I have none. So the idea of emergence of morphogenesis is crucial for assemblage theory, and this idea is imposed on the idea of contingent exterior relations. So the relations, this is the number 3, relations between assemblages and their parts are only exterior. So this means that there is no interior necessary relations. There are no necessary relations, only contingent relations, like let me think what an example I might provide. By saying that your organism works well we can think that there are some mechanisms by which your organism operates. And DeLanda says that those mechanisms and interactions between the organs which make you alive at all are only exterior and only contingent. They are not completely necessary. So if some kind of organ breaks, it can, how to say, it can re-emerge, it can heal itself. And this relation is not completely necessary, it's contingent. So next one, assemblages constitute a flat ontology, and I have said it too. So the idea that all entities in this substantive metaphysical scheme, all entities which you can imagine at all are ontologically equal. So there is no idea that some kind of entity is the more important than another. No, completely not. So the idea that the ontology of assemblage theory is completely flat surface. Oh, that stuff. So, sorry. I warned you, get prepared. It will be tough. So, briefly, characteristics of an assemblage. So, in Deleuze discerns three distinct instances of an assemblage. The instance of actual is the actual ontological properties. Like, this is a bottle. It is made of a glass. Glass has certain ontological characteristics, like it can melt in certain temperature, it can break by some kind of solid objects, and so on. It's actual. So virtual. Virtual is the most interesting, I guess. So virtual instance consists of tendencies. It's the ways the object might behave in certain circumstances. And attractors. Attractors are the stable states of a system. It's a concept brought from, again, dynamic systems theory. So the tendency of my bottle is to break down when I put it on the floor. And the breaking operation would be an attractor, so stable system state for a bottle to break down. Is it clear? Or should I repeat? Maybe. So, any object, any assemblage has a certain space of possibilities, space of possible states of a system. My bottle can break down, it can melt, it might behave somehow in a space, and insane amount of possibilities for that some kind of object or another object. And tendencies are the ways of the object, trajectories of object in which it can behave in different circumstances. Intensive instance is the instance of capacities. So capacity is the most crucial idea of assemblage theory. In capacities, there is one and only the most important capacity. It is capacity to form assemblages. It's capacity to interact. So capacity is about communication between objects. For this bottle to break down, it is needed the communication of the bottle and the solid object. And this process of the bottle breaking down would be an intensive process. Not virtual, not actual, but intensive. Intensive process is the process by which virtual instances become actual. So it's some kind of interface between virtual and actual. And this interface provides two-way traffic. But it's not important now. So the idea is that there are three distinct instances of any assemblage. One actual, its properties. One virtual, is the possible states of a system and what it might be like. And the next one, the intensive, is the instance of communicative instance of an object by which it may interact with another object. All that I have said for previous, I guess, 10 minutes is crucial for epistemology. Because if we assume two ideas, of DeLanda, the idea that the most basic theory of ontology is dynamic systems theory, where causality is nonlinear, and the next Deleuzean idea of univocity of being. This leads us to some kind of strange position, because epistemology becomes encapsulated in ontology. Our process, our very process of knowing becomes an object between other objects. We cannot, in this situation, we cannot account for conditions for possibility for very knowledge. Our knowledge becomes an object between among other objects. This is very, very bad, I guess. I will explain why. Okay. As I have said in this slide, so I will be talking right now about intensive capacities. And this is made possible by the idea that capacities are of two types. One, the capacity to affect and to be affected. To say my bottle to be able to be breaking down, it should have the capacity to be affected by a solid object. Otherwise, it will not break down. For this bottle to be breaking down, the solid object, which is the floor, should have the capacity to affect, to influence somehow, to produce some kind of concrete outcome. And these two types of capacities connected to the concept of exteriority, which is the main concept by which all assemblages interact, which means that the interaction between all assemblages is based on contingent and not necessary relations. This is the concept of exteriority. There is no internal relations between some kind of my organs and any objects at all. The idea of exteriority is the most crucial for the concept of assemblage, and the emergence is the idea which is dependent on the concept of assemblage. So my point is that if we are talking about emergence, we cannot, we absolutely cannot speak of flat ontology of any kind, since the concept of emergence, which is taken from dynamic systems theory, which is purely scientific, it absolutely cannot deal with flat ontology, because emergence needs both exterior and interior relationships, since it is a very systemic feature. Why? So the idea that emergence is possible only in a system. And when we take the concept of emergence out of the context of systems theory, be it dynamic systems theory, general systems theory, and so on, it doesn't matter. So by taking the concept of emergence out of the context, we completely dismiss the whole idea of emergence, because emergence is possible only in systems, and systems do have interior relations. Systems don't consist of only of external contingent relationships, because it wouldn't be a system. It would be some kind of different concept. So my point is that emergence needs both exterior and interior relationships. This means that it needs both contingent and necessary relationships. The next idea is that if we're speaking of a whole, like we can imagine that this bottle is whole, and if it is breaking down, the glass on the floor will be its parts. The idea that whole needs preceding parts, which are its conditions of possibilities. Hence, there should be transcendental necessity. Whoa. Oh, well, what a word. So the transcendental necessity here is meant to illustrate the idea that the glass of which this bottle is made is the condition of possibility of this very object. And it cannot be that glass of that bottle and this very bottle are ontologically equal objects dwelling on a flat surface. No, completely not. Whole is ontologically dependent on parts. Why? So both conditions of wholes and parts, conditions of possibility, are radically asymmetrical. And this idea contradicts totally to DeLanda's assemblage theory. Ontological dependence is the idea that if we assume that in order to some kind of interpersonal interaction to happen, there should be at least two humans, for example. Or for a city to be, there should be some kind of network of interpersonal networks. It's the example which DeLanda draws himself in his book New Ontology of Society. So the idea that ontological dependence is about that in order to one thing to exist, there should necessarily another thing exist. And their conditions of possibility are asymmetrical, since it will be illustrated on the next slide. So the fourth idea is that if the whole, any whole, depends on its parts, and parts depend on their own parts, flat ontology is impossible. Since if we have some kind of an object which made of parts, and it depends on its parts, and each of its parts depend on each own its parts, and so on. So we are arriving at some kind of this idea, like we have an organism, but it has organs, tissues, cells, biomolecules, atoms, and so on. Each level, each ontological level is dependent upon previous. Without biomolecules, there would be no cells. Without cells, no tissues, and so on. It might be illustrated by a simple mereological axiom, like if X is part of Y, and if Y is a part of X, then and only then X equals Y. What does it mean? It means that if some kind of interpersonal network is, if two people are a part of interpersonal network, the interpersonal network cannot be a part of each of those humans. The conditions of their possibility are radically asymmetrical. So this is the same idea for the bottle, for example. So if the glass of the bottle is the condition of possibility of the very bottle, it doesn't work vice versa. So the bottle cannot be the condition of possibility of the glass of which it is made. Is it clear? Yeah? Yeah. Okay, nice. So this is my idea of critiquing DeLanda's assemblage theory, and what should or might we do? We might proceed in, and why did I talk about only assemblage theory? It is because I guess assemblage theory is the most strong theoretic framework by which is used in the discourses of so-called discourses of decolonization. Why I'm putting those in quotes, I will explain in a minute. So the idea that we are trying to, when we are saying that we're trying to decolonize something, it is meant that there is some kind of implicit dichotomy of nature and culture. The concept of assemblage, for example, completely doesn't overcome the dichotomy of nature and culture. It does have it in an implicit way because it does equate ontology with politics, and by equating ontology with politics, we completely fall back in the idea that we are not doing non-anthropocentric philosophy, non-anthropocentric science. We're just assuming that it would be nice to think that some kind of a material object or environmental object has the same powers, or the same thoughts, or the same emotions like we humans do. And this is a very simplified, oversimplified example and oversimplified illustration. But the assemblage theory assumes that we might invent some kind of conceptual tools which might overcome the dichotomy and to think of things which are really do exist in the real world, which is behind our cognition, not by just appropriating those in our soft, how to say, soft worldview, where we humans, we have emotions, we have some kind of devices, like emotional devices and so on. The idea that we are projecting our own human feelings, human ways of acting on material objects, on we are giving causal powers to think we do not actually know do those have causal powers or not. And this is my main pretension to all philosophical, ontological turn theories, be it new materialism, be it theory of Anthropocene and so on. The idea that we are just projecting something on material and immaterial objects. We are not really knowing what exists and what happens at all. So my proposition is to go from some kind of metaphysical realism where we just put some ontological distinction, like the idea of univocity of being, the idea that this bottle feels almost like me, and this phone also, on this table also, and so on. Reverting from this idea to the idea of scientific realism and to the idea of empirical checking what we are saying, not just saying like, oh look, this is a river, it feels like me, it has feelings, for example, or wow, look, there is a mountain and feels like me. I'm very, except I apologize for oversimplifying some kind of environmental discourses, but this is how I feel about it. So my idea is not just to impose some kind of metaphysical distinction of giving causal powers to material and immaterial objects and giving agency to some things, to giving the possibility of acting. Reverting from this kind of realism to scientific realism, where we can check what we are saying and not just say something. This is why I propose to look closer on some kind of critical realism proposed by Roy Bahaska, and this is the idea that there are three distinct ontological domains, in which the first ontological domain, which is on the right, domain of empirical, is the domain where we humans can experience something by our senses. Like when we see that water boils at 100 centigrade, we assume that, wow, look, if A, then B, always. And this is the idea which Pascal critiques very crudely. So the domain of empirical, the domain where we can see something, hear, experience somehow by all our feelings. The domain of actual is the domain of things which might happen without us registering it. It might happen, but we didn't manage to see or somehow to perceive or experience it. This is the domain of actual. But in both those domains, we do not see the actual causes of what we see. This is why there is a third domain, domain of real. Domain of real consists of mechanisms, and this is crucial idea. So the mechanisms are some kind of causal, generative mechanisms providing causal laws for everything which happens. For everything which happens and which might be registered and experienced by us humans or might not. And this provides us with very, I guess, useful tools and devices. And this is another crucial idea. So My pretension to almost all those new materialist theories is about confusing thought objects and real objects. For example, when we're talking about an assemblage of this hat and this phone, how actually do we discern the thought object of an assemblage, like the real assemblage existing in front of me and the idea of that assemblage? So what almost all those new materialist theories do, they simply blur the distinction of thought object and real object, and this is a very crucial and bad idea. So why those theories are not useful for us. But this picture is not so right, because on the side of thought objects we have theory, and on the side of real object we have fact. No, it's not like this. It should be like this. Because on this slide, the distinction between thought objects and real objects is also screwed, is also confused. Because what is a fact? Fact is some kind of propositional knowledge, and knowledge is a thought object, really. So what it should be like, I guess. On the side of thought object, we should have theory and empirical, observational, and factual knowledge. And on the side of real object, we should have facts as things or states of the world. What does it mean? It means that when I'm talking about, for say, an assemblage, I do not speak of it like it is not, like it is completely clear that I'm talking about this material object. We should say that there is an idea of an assemblage, my perception of it, for example, and the really existing thing, for example. Oh, it's tough. So briefly, so how should it work? When we are studying something or trying to make something explicit, we should address some kind of an object and think that this object has some certain structure. Like this bottle is made of glass, and glass has certain chemical structure by which it can behave in different ways. Like in a certain circumstances it will melt, in a certain circumstances it will break down. And this is about structure, and this object has causal powers and ways of acting, and under certain conditions it might or might not provide some kind of actual outcome. This is the idea of Roy Pascal, and sorry for big quote, but this is crucial too. So the world consists of mechanisms, not events. Such mechanisms combine to generate the flux of phenomena that constitute the actual states and happenings of the world. They may be said to be real, though it is rarely that they are actually manifest, and rarer still that they are empirically identified by man. They are the intransitive objects of scientific theory. They are quite independent of man as thinkers, causal agents, and perceivers. They are not unknowable. All the knowledge of them depends upon a rare blending of intellectual, practice technical, and perceptual skills. They are not artificial constructs, but neither are they Platonic forms. So here we see that scientific realism in Pascal also denies Platonic forms, which, for example, DeLanda also denies. So the idea that by searching some kind, by studying something, be it some way of doing politics or another, we should search for some kind of mechanisms which govern the phenomena studied and identify those mechanisms. This is the most, how to say, difficult part, I guess, because we are arriving at a very strange position. So my talk was about invention of some kind of conceptual tools for decolonization, but I actually said about decolonization really couple of words. Accept my apology if you expected more than 2 words. But the first conclusion which I'm to make is that we should keep science, philosophy on the one side and politics on the another side. Keep them separated. Because they, as it is illustrated, they serve different needs. Objectivity and political struggle are completely distinct from each other, I think. Why? So, if we revert to some kind of new materialist theory, for example, which we just observed, assemblage theory, here philosophy and politics are not quite separated. And this is why all those new materialist theories fall back into anthropocentrism. They try to invent some kind of metaphysical justification of political struggle, of emancipation, be it ontological, object-oriented ontology, or speculative materialism. They all strive to provide a really real justification, ontological truth, about why our political struggle has a chance to be at all. I think that this kind of justification is political too, because all those philosophers do is just providing a justification for another people to making a political struggle, so making political decisions and actions. I think that this is quite bad, both for philosophy and for science, and not for politics. Politics is quite good on its own, since it doesn't need any ontological justification for it to go to be. It does have a justification in only in one case. In case of ontological turn, of which I have said some time ago, because their ontology is used as a methodological tool, it is reflexive. So by using ontology, we do not provide some kind of metaphysical truths about the world, like we should do this and don't do that. So this is not about ethics, it's not about politics, it's about studying something. I mean, an ontological term. And in this kind of philosophy, let it be. This kind of philosophy, this distinction is not clear. So, next. Environmental issues are scientific, and accelerationist and queer agendas are essentially political. What is meant by this? It is meant that, as I have said 1 minute ago, we should keep them separate, because political actions actually don't need any ontological, metaphysical justification for it to have some effect. It might have some effect, it doesn't need to be confused with philosophy or science or some kind of pseudoscience discourses. It might proceed on itself. So if we are trying to study something in scientific way, we should search for mechanisms governing phenomena in question. And politics, as I have said, is performative and not intransitive. It doesn't exist. It doesn't exist objectively, so to speak. Without humans, there is no politics about some kind of agendas which are presented on the slide. So it is not intransitive in a sense of which, for example, environmental issues are intransitive. They are existent. They would be without humans to live on the Earth. So Earth might exist and humans might not exist, and there might be environmental issues. But with humans on the Earth, there are more environmental issues. And this is why it is common to speak of them like of political struggle problems. And my final, I guess, thought, which was the main throughout my talk, is that we should deny postulating some metaphysical distinction and proceed empirically, and empirically checking what we are talking about, and not just talk about something, but to provide some kind of evidence, of proof, and not just imposing like principle of univocity of being, or some kind of giving causal powers or agency to material objects and saying that, like, how do you know that objects actually have agency to and capacity to act? And how do you know that this bottle and this table exist equally on ontological level? You don't have any devices, you don't have any resource to talk like this. And this is why I propose to check empirically and to provide evidence for while we are doing some kind of philosophy or science or politics. Thank you very much. Okay, questions, maybe? Yes.
We have about 5-10 minutes for questions for Valerii.
Thank you for this very soft lecture, but I enjoyed it very much. And since we have the topic of our class was psychology, and it's my attempt to turn these highly philosophical concepts into more utilitarian. So my question would be, you mentioned about this impossibility of decolonization of something. And these days, this concept of decolonization of nature became kind of trendy. And since we're living here in a Scandinavian country, the concept of sustainability, sustainable production is also highly in effect, and it also becomes very trendy. And I would like to ask you, how can you maybe criticize, or maybe it goes along with assemblage theory, how you can criticize this concept of sustainability, sustainable production, from the point of view of assemblage theory? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Very nice question. So I would say that the idea of sustainable production is very, I guess, political in its essence. So it's not about some kind of searching for. It's useful. It's useful. It's very comfortable to go along with it, because otherwise it would be not so much cool for us humans or for nature. But I don't think that the concept of sustainability deals so much with nature itself. It deals more with, I guess, it deals more with the idea that how to make that we will not harm ourselves more. So we should make some kind of mechanism to provide ourselves with less harm, which we might give ourselves. So this is not the idea of, I guess, true decolonization, because we are not decolonizing something. We are just making something useful and making something less harmful for us.
It's like more comfortable anthropocentrism, right?
Yes, exactly. So, and I think that this is not so fair. It's not fair decolonization. It's decolonization for its own sake. I hope I answered your question. Thank you.